We have to remember that the removal really changed everything for our ancestors. We were a woodland people. Our homes were made out of tree bark. Our home goods and vessels were made out of bark. We ate fish and wild rice as our main food staples. And after the removal, we were moved to the Central Plains, to what is today known as the Flint Hills. There are very few trees. There are very few waterways. So our food sources had to change. Our medicine sources had to change. We had to learn how to be a Great Lakes people living on the Great Plains, and that was a really challenging transition. For those of our ancestors that were on the Trail of Death, when they arrived in Kansas, there was another outbreak of disease and more loss. It was a very hard winter, that first winter. We first settled on a reservation that's a little bit towards the center of eastern Kansas, and almost from the moment we arrived, there were questions about whether or not that was going to be our permanent home. It was a very hard adjustment. We had to think about what we wanted our visitors to feel when they had left this really heavy exhibit of the removal and moved into Kansas. And we weren't ready for them to feel real comfortable yet. You know, this was still a very uncomfortable time for our ancestors, and we needed it to be a slightly uncomfortable time for our visitors. And so we chose very bold, some may say a little obnoxious, colors of yellow. And it's floor to ceiling, yellow and gold. And that represents the wheat and the open, vast plains that our ancestors would have found in Kansas. It's also sort of represents that lack of waterways. You know, we went from being in a heavily wooded area where you sometimes could barely see the sky because of the canopy to miles and miles of open plains and open sky. And it was a very jarring experience, and so that yellow really helps to kind of keep the visitors in a state of feeling like this is something that is not quite right. It's not quite comfortable, and that's exactly what we're going for.
Architectural features of this particular gallery is meant to symbolize sort of a winding, meandering sort of time, I think, in the tribe's history, to where the people seem to really be lost. They're coming out of removal from a location that they understood and had lived for generations to a new, open, somewhat desolate place. We wanted to place the map that's seen at the entrance of the gallery to better educate people as to what the removal process in that period was about truly. Many people focus just on the Trail of Death and think that was the sole removal, which it wasn't. It's the most notarized removal, but it's one of many over a 20-year period. Several groups removed to different areas. Some removed to Iowa, some removed to Missouri, while others removed to Kansas. So we wanted to document just that, to let people know where those locations were. But we also wanted to supplement that with our other displays that show what leaders of these groups, what activities they were doing, their relationships with the government at that time in their community, and where they led their people.
My process for deciding on what objects went on display was really just what Blake wanted. Since he's been here for so long, he really knows the collection well. I haven't been here for that long, and so he'd be like, well, I know that we have this bandolier bag or something. And so it was mostly just him giving me ideas to find these objects, but really it was conditionally how the object could be displayed. So there were quite a few things that we couldn't display because they wanted them mounted off the wall and it just wouldn't have worked. And so really it was just Blake giving me ideas. I'd make a catalog for him, and then we would fight about whether that object could go on display or not.
We wanted to display Abram right there at the entrance to illustrate what his role was during this period, his relationship with the Baptist mission, but also other members in the community who had more established relationships with the Catholic missionaries, but sort of the political diversity and the varied experiences between those two. But also to display that Abram was a leader at this time. He was a successful businessman. but he was more of a leader of the people, if you will, a spokesman for what the community truly felt and thought. The white building that Abrams displayed in front of is really just sort of a replica vignette of what a schoolhouse would have looked like at that time, or a mission building at that time. And I think it's interesting to see sort of the juxtaposition between him sitting in front of that, but representing more of the community voice opposed to more of the mission or the foreign voice, if you will.
A lot of the ancestors of our tribal members today can track back that their ancestors went to St. Mary's. It was really at the center point of reservation life. Even if tribal members weren't overtly religious, their life was still shaped by the missionaries and the fact that their children were being put into the school system, and that this was the next step in this assimilation process that the federal government saw as the new push for Indian policy. Is now that we have them removed to the West, the best chance for their survival is to make them more like us, to push out the things about them that are native, and to make them more American, to make them more like me and you, me and you being the Indian agents and the people who are making the policies.
We obtained the nails through a historical society in eastern Kansas, the Swan River Historical Society. They had done several archaeological surveys at the site of St. Mary's Mission, where they've obtained those nails and other artifacts. They were kind enough to gift those to us for display and for preservation. There was a lot of things that people had to work through. So understanding those hardships, we definitely wanted to celebrate the successes of those who were able to take and work from those hardships and create something new. The interactive that we have displayed displays just that, key individuals, where their businesses were located, and a little bit more about them so that people can connect with them one-on-one.
So our reservation, even though it had been promised to us as a sanctuary where we would not have to deal with non-natives, that did not work out. Our reservation was on the Kansas River, which was one of the major waterways that ran east and west through Kansas. And when more settlers started to move to the west because of gold found in California, because of the national goal of having a railroad that connected Chicago to the West Coast, as well as the Civil War and all of the things that were happening nationally in the United States in the middle of the 19th century, we had hundreds upon hundreds of people who were flooding to the west each year, and they were going through our reservation.
The trails that crossed through the reservation at that time, I think, brought a little bit more hardship than it did successes. But again, people were able to take a difficult time and mold that into something that would flourish. Particularly Louis View was able to do that. He operated a ferry that crossed over a small tributary of the Kansas River called the Red Vermilion, which was a crossing point for people on California and Oregon trails. But he would set up trade posts along that to where people could obtain supplies. But oftentimes people would leave supplies behind, or they would want to barter supplies, and he was able to use those, sort of refurbish them, if they will, and recycle them back into consumer products. But we wanted to display him there again with a cutout to really amplify his success. He was an extremely successful businessman, and because of his successes, he was an initial member of the business committee that was established in 1860. But there are records that indicate that he made upwards of $300 to $350 a day through his ferry service. I think we found it important to display press or headlines at that time to exhibit the misconceptions that people had of what was happening in Indian territory and what lands were available. These very celebratory headlines overshadowed the dark side of the way in which the lands were acquired. But we wanted to put that on display for members of our community so that they could be better educated to understand the trials and tribulations that their ancestors had to face, and being able to draw successes from that. But we also wanted to educate individuals outside of the community that really don't have either a basic or really detailed knowledge of Native history, specifically that with Pottawatomie, but what truly the relationship between the American government, businesses associated with the government, and tribal communities were having to face at that time.
We're getting into a time period of the mid-1800s in this section of the museum, so we're starting to see a lot more written record. Newspapers are left behind. The documents from the Indian agents are very numerous. So the written record here is something that we were able to start calling upon as pieces that we could actually pull into the museum exhibit. So, you know, when there would be a cholera outbreak or they were setting out Indian land for sale, you actually have the broadsides and you have the newspaper clippings from this time period, and it really helps to drive home for the visitor that this is a time when the Pottawatomie daily experience is starting to become more like a national experience. The national mood and the things that are going on in America at the time are invading upon us, and we're really not able to stay in our own sort of separated world anymore. We're being pulled along on this tide of American history. Unfortunately, the people who were traveling west didn't just bring with them their cash for, you know, business transactions. They also brought whiskey and violence, and it was a really interesting time to live on our reservation because, you know, you had these immigrant parties of often young, unmarried men who would cause trouble and cause chaos and brought a lot of discord to the reservation, and there wasn't enough law enforcement to really respond to that. And so it was a very troublesome time to live in Kansas and on our reservation in particular.
The medical journal that we have displayed was created and belonged to Joseph Napoleon Bursaw. He was a tribal businessman, sort of a mediator, if you will, between members of the community and individuals in the government. He had had this long-established relationship with the government prior to removal, serving as an interpreter and a mediator as well. But I think the book symbolizes sort of this crossroads of culture, and the attempt that a community who is sort of somewhat lost on the prairie and being forced to engage in a new lifestyle is able to preserve it through their key medicines, through true traditional practices and document them as such, but also to take that knowledge and recreate it in a new environment, and to be able to utilize those gifts that are given, you know, through nature, and help sustain that balance between the community and nature and create this medicinal journal. We want to display, one, the importance and power that women held in the community. Even though the Pottawatomie are a patrilineal society, women held an important part there, the ways in which they helped govern the community, especially business at this point, and the preservation of culture. There's some groundbreaking moves, I think, in ways of female empowerment or feminism that was felt by the entire community during this period, to which a treaty was established in 1866, which accounted for women being considered as head of households, that they could manage the affairs just as well as men could in ways of land dealings, sales, and acquisition.
Obviously, Abram Burnett's cane and dirks that we had got from the Kansas State Historical Society, because he's such a prominent tribal member. But really, I think the doll, we don't have any information on it. I've put it in the Hownicon to see if anyone knows anything. But all we do know is it came from Kansas. And so I'm really drawn to that piece.
Well, we wanted to include an interactive in this section to understand that the subject matter is extremely heavy, it's extremely dense, and having the ability to condense that down or make it understandable to general audiences, even specialized audiences, was quite a task. So what we wanted to do was create a small feature, a small video that helped describe sort of the environment at that time, the relationship again between the government and the tribe, and really what the stipulations of the 1861 treaty were about, preceding the actual execution of the treaty itself and then the aftermath of it.
Unfortunately, the railroad had an impact on our ancestors' existence in Kansas in a very negative way. Almost from the moment we moved on to the Kansas River Reservation, there was pressure on us to somehow transfer our lands to the railroad. So first, we were threatened that we would be removed again. And our Indian agents would even sometimes say, you know, we don't know what will happen to you if we continue to move you west into the territories of some tribes who don't want you there. You may end up being killed by these individuals, and they would use that as a threat. Eventually, they came to the policy of allotment, and their proposed reason to allot our reservations and give tribal members individual plots of land was for the assimilation and betterment of the tribe. But there was always the clause in those decisions that any surplus land or any land that wasn't allotted at that time would thereby be opened up for sale to the railroad. So there's really no denying that the policy was twofold. One, to try to assimilate Native Americans into American culture, and two, try to get as much land as possible into the hands of the federal government, who would then open it up to the railroad. Our ancestors faced this question of the division of our reservation into private plots for allotment in 1861. The federal government was being pressured greatly by the railroads to open up as much of that land along the Kansas River as possible. The railroads at this time really required a lot of water to function, and so our reservation was on prime real estate. So they began to push the Pottawatomie to sign this treaty that would divide up our common reservation into plots of land or allotments that would be given out to every living tribal member on the reservation at that time. There was no accommodation made for future generations. And there was an additional caveat that once our tribal members had become land-owning farmers and began to live like the rest of Americans, that we would eventually become American citizens. By becoming American citizens, though, they were insisting that we give up and denounce that we were Native Americans. As it was written, didn't have to be a complete failure. It was laid out in a very specific order. First, there would be a census taken of who wanted to be land-owning U.S. citizens eventually, and who wanted to continue to hold land in common. And that was the separation between the citizen Pottawatomie and the prairie Pottawatomie. And then there was a survey done of the reservation, and it was broken up into plots. They created an allotment grid. And then each tribal member was supposed to choose their acreage, depending on their role in their family, dictated how many acres they received. After that, they were supposed to have a portion of money that was given to them to buy seed, and farm equipment was supposed to be made available. And they were supposed to have 2 seasons to make it as successful farmers with crop yields that would allow them to have an income. After that, they would be able to be assessed taxes like other individuals who were landowners. That is not how it played out. The monies were not paid out in a timely manner. The promised farm equipment did not arrive as it was supposed to arrive, and people were taxed on their land before they had any chance of having any kind of income. That is how a lot of our ancestors ended up losing their land. They would have to sell off their land to buy food to survive. They would have to sell off their land to pay taxes. And it slowly was chipped away so that after 5 years, most of the individuals who had been allotted parcels of land were absolutely landless and destitute. And the federal government had to negotiate yet another treaty to provide a reservation here in Indian Territory that we ended up buying with the proceeds from selling what little land we did have left in Kansas. We try to really explain this 1861 treaty in a lot of detail because it is when we become the citizen Pottawatomie. This is when we become a distinct tribe separated from our prairie Pottawatomie kinsmen. So to highlight this, we actually showed some of the text from the treaty. We also have a short video that really explains the circumstances that are around this treaty, how it came to be, some of the particular clauses that were the most problematic, and how it ultimately led to our ancestors not becoming successful farmers in the West, but landless and in need of moving out of Kansas altogether and moving to Indian Territory.
The documents, though, were preserved by Richard Johnson, and he decided to donate that along with the trunk and the other gallery with various other artifacts during this time period. But we definitely felt that it was important to show that there is a tangible artifact that went along during this time period, and that all of these records are not just obtained by the U.S. government, that they were available for the community to read and to understand. The overall goal of the gallery was to show the transition between a Great Lakes way of life to a new life in Indian Territory, from figuring out ways to combat, but also make amends with assimilation and acculturation, understanding that this was a necessity to continue life, but hopefully to create a new life and understand ways that culture could be sustained and perpetuated for future generations.